little spring in our step around here on this thing called the Just Start the Conversation podcast. It is brought to you by St. Luke's Penn Foundation. My name is Kevin Crockett. Very excited to be back once again, talking with my good friend Amie Alanson Dundon. Amie, we got it's feeling a little springy out there, right? We
It's
got
so
a little
nice.
sunshine and some warmth.
The sunshine is good. I'm so ready for warmer weather, so we're good.
It's we already should have done an episode on seasonal depression because we should be over that now. But we're having an excellent conversation today. We've had a lovely conversation off the air. I expect the same warm, dynamic personality on the episode today with Andrea Breter. She is the Clinical Coordinator of Psychotherapy at St. Luke's Health Network. And today we're going to be talking about perinatal mood and anxiety disorders such as postpartum depression. And one of the things, Andrea, that I like that we talked about off camera before we got rolling here is Amie and I both kind of take this approach. We're having very serious conversations. We encourage you to do just that. Just start the conversation. And one of the things that I loved in talking to you right off the bat was you talking about how you use a little bit of a lighter personality. You can approach things with a little bit of humor if you need to. And certainly, I think that is a good bridge and a gap when we're having difficult conversations. So first and foremost, I haven't even said hello to you formally yet, but thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here. Looking
Excited.
forward to it.
Now, yes, so this is her. I don't want to put you on the spot, but this is the first podcast. So
hey, I'm here for it. Developing a new skill
New
set.
stuff.
New skill set.
Andrea's not new to presenting or being in front of people or lecturing. She's very good at that.
Yeah, no, actually, I presented on Saturday, so I'm good. I'm like oiled up, ready to go. We're good.
That's probably not how I would have put it, but that's good. All right, we are ready to rock. So the topic is perinatal mood disorders. So I think one of the things as we talk about, okay, what to expect when you're expecting, right? That's always a conversation of a book and an idea that people have as we get started in the process of, oh my gosh, we're having a baby. For the mother in particular, as dads, I'm a father of two. I did the best that I could to try to understand as much as I could, help out where I could, know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when it was like, come in here, I need some help, and know when it was like, go somewhere, I need some time to myself. So I guess one of the first things that I'll start with you, Andrea, here is just kind of that expected versus the unexpected as you are going through the process of being pregnant, you're having a baby, you're doing all those things. Just some of those expectations versus what may come as a curveball or something you're not prepared of in the process.
Yeah, I know in my experience, like that's some of like the most like common, one of the most common stressors I see that pops up, right? Where I think everyone who I encounter, I don't know about you, Amie, but like I know for myself, I love to talk about myself. I had a set of expectations, an idea of like what it would look like for my partner, and I think the same would go for him. Of course, we don't talk about that either, too, right? Which is a whole separate conversation in and of itself. Right. But I think it's important, and the advice that I give anyone who comes into my office, it's important, when you're starting the process of, trying to conceive, or if you're pregnant, develop that plan, sit down, have a conversation, and start to talk about how do we handle stress?
Yeah.
How do we prepare if like, okay, this is our birth plan, for example, and it doesn't go to plan? What do we do? How do we manage things like, okay, if we have a really gassy baby and baby doesn't like to sleep, what do we do? Mm-hmm. So we're already prepared, and we have an idea of how to kind of accept when things don't go to plan. Because, for a lot of us, that can be a difficult thing to accept that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Amie, I kind of want to talk about it's interesting as Andrea kind of talks about those conversations. I felt like I was learning on the fly quite a bit with my wife, particularly postpartum. There were a lot of things that I kind of needed explained to me in a very nice way. Sometimes not the nicest way, but just that there were some things there that I needed to understand and try to be a good partner in. Can we talk about the role a little bit of the partner in this situation? Listen, I've never been pregnant. I don't know what it does to your body. I don't know what it does to you mentally, the physical, the quite literal physical toll that it could take on your body. For somebody who is kind of on the outside looking in, perhaps some advice that maybe you would give to someone who maybe is seeing some signs of something going on, something maybe postpartum going on, or an anxiety level that you might see heightened, just kind of that, hey, perhaps we should talk to somebody about what's going on here a little bit.
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, if you're fortunate to have a partner when you're pregnant, right? Not everybody does, right?
Sure.
Right.
But, sit down with your partner well before your due date and talk about your mental health. I would, in an ideal world, our partner will already know if we're somebody that's predisposed to anxiety or predisposed to depression or has anxiety or panic attacks or maybe has had some trauma in their past, right?
Right.
It's important to talk to your partner about when you're not pregnant, about your mental health, so that when you are pregnant, that person, it's not going to be a difficult conversation to have.
Right. And I think off that too, that conversation should go both ways.
Right.
Too, because I think sometimes, and I've noticed, I think sometimes we're a little mom-centric, if you will. Dads have needs too. And it's been often, it pops up in my office where the mom ends up identified somehow, or actually it's really dad or the partner who really needs to be in my office. So having that conversation, I think both ways. What does our mental health look like? What do we need? I think to your question, Crockett, I guess about like the partner and like what he could do in this situation, or any partner could do in this situation. I think, talking openly, hey, what do you need now? Like, how do we manage our stress? How do we manage, if we're feeling a little extra irritable, kind of like those things that come before, like we're in like crisis mode, if you will. Something I use in my office, I use a postpartum support coping plan, and I'll do that with a couple, or if it's just mom in my office, and we'll kind of identify those things ahead of the game.
Yeah.
So we know like who our support
Right.
team is, kind of what those strategies are, and how we can implement those for both people to ensure best mental health outcomes.
Right. And I would say you should have a list. There's something we use in mental health called a wellness recovery action plan. So in kind of crosswalking that to what Andrea is talking about is, what are signs that my partner would be able to pick up on to know that maybe I'm decompensating a little bit or I'm not okay? What are the things that I'm going to write down for them when I'm well to say, hey, if you see me sleeping, again, it's a little bit different with new babies. We sleep when we can sleep. But if you see me unable to stop crying for more than 30 minutes, if you see me not eating and just not having an appetite, or if you see me withdrawing more, these are signs that I probably need a little bit of help, and I'm going to need someone to talk to, or I'm going to need you to approach me, right? And so have the plan before it happens, and don't assume that mental health concerns and issues won't happen to me. I'm fine. It doesn't happen to me.
Yeah, and I explain it like sometimes we have things that are subclinical that when we go through like any major stressor, right? So in this case, even though we're making the assumption, right, that having this baby is a very wanted and positive thing, right? Sometimes this massive shift can also, even when it's wanted, and this is going back to the whole idea of like the unexpected versus the expected, right? This baby is a massive shift. And there is no book. You can read every book, and like you don't know till you know, like that whole acronym, like the kids say, like you don't know till you know when you're in it. But this massive shift, right, that just kind of kicks that subclinical whatever it is, anxiety, OCD, depression, et cetera, just into high gear, and then like boop, like then we're over the edge, and now it's a problem. So even, and I don't know, how do we kind of identify those things? Like I know I really love routine. So that was really eye-opening. I think because of what I do, that I had that level of insight. I'm like, oh, I'm having this experience right now. But I know that I'm very type A, kind of OCD at baseline.
Right. So that's a good example of, okay, so then, Andrea, if you would have started to have repetitive, invasive thoughts, intrusive thoughts, compulsive behaviors like cleaning or thoughts of hurting or harming your baby, those are all signs that maybe your obsessive compulsive personality traits, the hormones and the body change of it all has kind of kicked that anxiety, that OCD into high gear.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I explain for for both entities, like using like what I think we all call really like the biopsychosocial model of parenthood, right? And I'm going to talk about moms, just sitting here as a mom, but it applies to dads too. We certainly look at the biology, right? There's all these hormonal changes. It's amazing the amount of women I see who don't follow up on their postpartum labs,
Right.
who maybe had like gestational diabetes or maybe some thyroid issues, for example, and things can go a little wonky there. That can push things over the edge. So as a partner, keeping on track of like the medical needs, psychologically, massive cognitive shift, right? Here you have two people who just kind of do their thing, right?
Yep.
And we work together, we're assuming we communicate well, but we really do our own thing. We're responsible for ourselves. Now we share this human, and that's just, a lot of things. And then socially, right, we have, loss of identity, there's work changes. We're trying to navigate all the other stuff, finances, maybe living arrangements, and the list goes on.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that it's about 85% of women have what we call baby blues after we have a baby. So that's close to everybody goes through a period of depression that isn't, when Andrea says subclinical, that's kind of what we mean. That isn't diagnosable depression, but it is a real present concern issue set of symptoms for most women, and partners, right, can also experience the baby blues, right? Very common. But it's understanding when is it baby blues versus major depression versus bipolar disorder. Like those are things that if you're concerned or as a partner, you're concerned about the person that has had the baby, talk to their PCP, talk to their OBGYN, get somebody else to say, oh yeah, completely normal, you're right. Or,
or hey, like we need
like
to
labs,
intervene.
let's look.
Right. And, even if, there's a situation too where maybe, in this case, I'll say like the mom, isn't going to a PCP immediately, or even like her OBGYN. The pediatrician is certainly a good resource, and pediatricians can certainly like make referrals, and they'll assess mom as well. They should be administering go ahead, I'm sorry.
No. I was just going to say, I kind of want to touch into kind of coming back to those intrusive thoughts and what elaborating a little bit on what might not feel normal in that moment, but absolutely is normal. I just a little bit of, because again, as we kind of talk about it, it's interesting in talking with you both who have had children, and then from me, from the perspective of the trying to be, a good husband and support. There were certainly times in my wife's pregnancy, she had two very different pregnancies and had two very different postpartums. And certainly when our first was born, I was trying to understand a lot of things. And I think maybe for both parties, what might not be considered a normal thought in non-parent world are very normal. These intrusive thoughts, these things are, and then yes, to your point, you have to know the difference between intrusive thoughts and major depression, things of that nature. But just some of those intrusive thoughts that to you might not seem quote unquote normal, but in this situation are very, very normal for a lot of people.
Yeah. So I think one of like the most common, and maybe this can speak to, all of us, right, who identify as parents, we have this baby, right, and the intrusive thought, like walking up or down the stairs, like what if I drop the baby? Mm-hmm. Or even you can also have intrusive images, and some people will report to me like, hey, like I could see myself like dropping the baby, and like being super freaked out by that.
Sure.
Right. And I think it's very common for there to be intrusive thought, and this is like a longer conversation. I'm going to try to keep it like very concise. It is very common to have intrusive thoughts that revolve around harm topics. Mm-hmm. It's very common to have like some excessive intrusive thoughts about worries of like something happening, like catastrophic illness. It's important to voice those thoughts, right? And I tell everyone, I'm like, the difference is when they're ego dystonic versus they're ego systonic, right? Like when you're totally freaked out by these thoughts, they're ego dystonic, right? Like they're outside your belief system. Like there's no indication like I want to act on these, nothing like that. And then we go through and we kind of assess like, okay, these are intrusive thoughts. All people have intrusive thoughts. Why this type now? Well, you've never had a baby before. You've never cared about anyone like this before. And then we get kind of into like the evolutionary basis of that, where it's protective.
Yeah.
We keep eyes on it. The other thing with this population too is we don't want to over normalize, right? And we don't want to miss anything, you know? And I think it's so important to normalize that, okay, you're going to see probably more than likely, I don't think I've ever run into anybody who hasn't, have an uptick in intrusive thoughts. But we need to say them out loud.
We don't talk about them.
Right.
I wish
Yes.
somebody would have said to me, hey, that thought you're having, you're okay.
Yeah.
Because I was concerned.
Like, you're not a bad mom. You're not going to act on it.
Right.
You're probably not going to lose your mind. Like, you know, and like if there are times where you start to believe this, or if it falls more into like the OCD realm, we can talk about that. We can get you help and we can treat that. So it's important that we talk about these and we say them out loud, and we give them less power when we say them out loud.
Is that, I have to think for the two of you, when perhaps it comes to couples having those conversations, really that's in essence, you had the chance. I don't want to say you had the chance to communicate and you didn't, because that sounds, but like maybe there was just a bit of being naive. You're being a parent perhaps for the first time and just not knowing what to expect.
Yeah, I think sometimes too, it's, you know, we don't know what to expect. And, you know, I joke with people, I'm like, oh my God, like if people actually told me what it was like to have a kid, like would we scare people? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, like there's some level of that. Do you know what I mean? Like
we're protecting the species by not telling anybody.
Like, well, you know, I remember one of my friends, a very good friend of mine for decades, who told me, you know, because I'm one of the last to have children, and she's like, I don't want to tell you, you know, some of the things, because I felt like, you know, there's like a protective piece, you know, didn't want to scare you, you know, and like you just like you don't know until you know again, until you're like in this club. And, you know, it's part of the stigma, right? You know, and I think it's overly glamorized. I don't know, Amy, if you agree. It's glamorized, like you should be so happy, this should be a good thing, like I should have this overwhelming love, happiness, contentment. And it's not, and there's a lot of hard, and we didn't even talk about like sleep deprivation.
And also, I don't know that some women, and again, some partners don't feel comfortable whether you're in a same-sex marriage or not. Your partner, it may be a little scary to tell them, listen, I'm having these thoughts about falling down the steps with the baby. And like, you know, what's this other person? How's this? I don't want to scare them. I don't want to scare my partner. So I'm just not going to say anything. Right. And then it just builds, and the anxiety builds, and it becomes panic, right? And we start to have panic attacks and anxiety attacks, and, you know, we're not really using our coping skills. So I would say, you know, to help the new parents, both of them, there should be set time to really use some mindfulness, some deep breathing, some time to process thoughts in an open, non-judgmental way, I guess.
I tell the wording I use in my office, I say, you know, try to make some space where you can be intentional with each other. You know, and I said, you know, it's so easy. Like I joke with my husband, I'm like, hello, ship. We're in that stage of life, right? Where we're just kind of passing in the night, right? But this started in the very beginning, right? For, you know, our reasons. And then when we, you know, adding to the family, there's no such thing as you do it once. You can, I mean, yes, you can do it again, but even that, again, massive shift, right? So being intentional with each other, and I think sitting down and be like, hey, how you doing today?
Yeah.
You know, like, where's your head at? Like, and we're so weird with being vulnerable, right? I think with our partners too, like that was like a whole new thing. Like I remember like this whole set of emotions that unlocked once I became a parent, and sitting down with my husband, and, you know, if he's going to listen to this, but like, and like having some of this conversation with him, like I'm struggling with like this or that. And, you know, and he was wonderful. He was very supportive, you know, and but it's a very hard thing to like let that out. But again, being intentional, even just sitting down and like starting and even approximating towards that, I think is a really good skill to have.
You know, I think one of the early on when our firstborn was born, when this light bulb went off in my head of just kind of how my wife may be looking at things and taking things versus how perhaps I was seeing them, was the first night our daughter Savannah slept for more than 3 hours. And we woke up in the morning and it was daylight And in my mind, I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, we finally got a full night of sleep.
Yeah.
And my wife
Was panicked.
shot
Probably
out of
flew.
bed.
Yep.
Flew out of bed.
And
Yes.
was like, what? And it was just one of those moments where it was like, and typically she is the one that is more anxious or type A and those sorts of things. But that was when it really hit me that like, wow, there's a next level to this right now. I kind of want to talk about those levels a little bit because, Andrea, to your point, it's funny. We talked about kind of the vulnerability of talking to our partner. Part of that might be because you almost maybe feel like you're presenting a side of yourself that no matter how long you've been with a person, that they
it's new.
have never
it's
seen
new.
before.
Right. Yeah, it's new. Like I mean, unless maybe you entered into this as parents, you know what I mean, into
Right.
your relationship.
Yeah.
You know, then maybe it's a bit different. But even that, like, but usually it's not in the beginning, right? Where you're figuring out, like, okay, like one day my kid's gonna sleep through the night and like it's gonna like freak me out, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's
And yes, sorry to interrupt, but and yes, and I'll say, let's take it back a step to the vulnerability of a woman after having given birth, the vulnerability of what our bodies look like and do in the first 4, 8, 12 weeks after
Yeah.
giving birth. It's not pretty. And it's certainly difficult to be vulnerable and completely shower or ask,
Sure.
need help with kind of, just self-care after childbirth. It's very humbling.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when it's hard too. I think, you know, those Crockett, going back to what you were saying about levels, you know, I think to Amie, your point, like when we're not feeling well about ourselves, like those can jack up some of the levels. If you mean in terms of like you're talking about like the anxiety levels, right?
Yeah,
Like when we're not.
just kind of I guess from whether it's it could be anyone who's kind of around you and knows you and is around it could be your parents, it could be your in-law, it could be whoever that may be. Just the I guess where I was kind of going with it was more the level of how do we know almost when to be concerned? How do we know when we're going from just like, okay, this is normal behavior follow, and then versus okay, we're getting into
Sure.
a point where I think we should talk to somebody.
Yeah. So I tell everyone like it's kind of like the weather and versus the climate, right? I think anything that you're just like, hey, like that seems a little off today, right? Like we prepare, we address it, kind of like the weather. Like today it's sunny out, you know, so, you know, and it's warm. So, okay, I'm not going to bring a jacket. Like we attend to it, right? So I would say to you, like if there was something that was off, I would say to my partner, like, hey, like I noticed this today. So I think just kind of starting that conversation with your partner before we're in like crisis mode, and you're like, whoa, like all of this is weird. Mm-hmm. I think having that conversation and like just asking like, hey, like I noticed this, like, are you okay? You good? Like, do you need anything? Starting there, and you just kind of keep assessing as you go from, you know, and kind of determining like, okay, do we need more support in place?
Yeah. And I also think, yes, and, you know, if it's lasting longer, then, you know, if whatever this mood is or this change is or this concern is persistent for months, right? I mean, it's normal to have a couple months of I'm not myself. But when
Yeah.
it persists longer than that, I think that's next level.
Sure. Yes. And even before that, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like, you know, if you're noticing, you know, back to what Amie was saying about the baby blues. So the baby blues, usually we see, you know, as I'm educated, like things kind of level out a little bit. Some of that early depression, you know, anxiety, that like up, down, as I call it, the up, down, all around, those feelings as like sleep kind of normalizes, pass. But if you're noticing lingering symptoms past that point, it's worth having a conversation. It's worth addressing with your partner, with your healthcare provider. And this could be anything from depression, anxiety, I'm feeling extra OCD, certainly anything that would be considered really abnormal, like we would see like in like the realm of like psychosis, that should be a true medical emergency. And that's
Right.
911, the emergency room, that sort of thing.
Yeah, postpartum psychosis is very, very rare, you know, but it really does happen. And that onset usually is between 24 hours to 3 weeks after delivery. So, you know, that's where we would see the psychosis really, which is confused, cognitive impairment.
Yeah, you would see some of these like what we were calling ego systonic thoughts thoughts with intent behind them. Like, I'm going to do possibly something to myself, the baby, or feeling compelled to do something harmful. Again, true medical emergency, very rare, but it does happen.
I think it's the number that I have is it occurs in 1 to 3 in 1,000 births.
Yeah, I have 1 to 4. Yeah, but
Okay.
yeah,
So-
it's very rare. But however, it's why it's important to just keep eyes on each other, and I think anything that seems like, hey, this is different, and just checking it, being intentional,
Yeah.
right? And
If
having that
something
conversation.
seems disturbing, then it probably is, and we need to
Yep.
you or your partner, and you need to take that seriously.
So if if you're a single mom, if you are somebody that's in a relationship, whatever dynamic might actually be there, if you're noticing something, primary care is the first phone call you make in these situations.
Or your OBGYN,
Yeah, primary care, OBGYN,
pediatrician, whoever you see. You're going to see all of them a lot. So
Yeah, lactation.
lactation consultants,
Yeah. So
midwives.
Can we actually talk about that a little bit? Because I
Sure.
think as we're talking about expected versus unexpected, that was a hurdle for my wife with our firstborn was breastfeeding, where I think maybe I don't want to assume anything for anyone, especially as the one who's not having a baby and breastfeeding, but that you would perhaps the expectation is that is kind of a turnkey process for someone. Can we
Right.
go into the effect that can play on your mental health? Because it could be you want to talk about if you already have anxiety, you already have OCD, and all of a sudden this thing that felt, I'll use turnkey again, that you were expecting would be there isn't there. That could really make things difficult mentally.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I think for, and I don't want to make an assumption, but I'm going to overgeneralize a little bit. I think for a lot of women, it's kind of expected, your phrase, like turnkey, right? Well, how are you going to feed your baby? Well, I'm going to breastfeed, and I think, again, like one of my own expectations, I had this image of like what it would be like. It was much easier in my mind.
Yeah.
So spoiler alert,
Yeah.
it didn't go to
Sure.
plan. It didn't go to plan. But I can tell you, and partly, as I'm educated and through even my own lived experience, but like the amount of women who report feelings of like guilt, because of,
Sure.
the anxiety then over, depending like how things are going, like, is my baby
Getting enough?
That's where I was going. Yep. Getting enough. Are they getting enough? How do I know that they're getting enough? What if they're not getting enough? What else can I do to ensure they're getting enough? And I have women who will go through, if we're a little bit maybe more on the OCD realm, all sorts of different methods from
Sure.
appointments to pumps to different things to help support their goals. But then, part of our job and like my job with these women I see is I really integrate my approach then like between the women I see by asking like, okay, like what is your goal? For all of us, our goal really is I have to feed the baby, right? That's our goal. So working with them to, okay, with any goal we have, we keep our goal. I heard this line from someone, actually in our psych department, so I can't even coin it. But we keep our goal concrete, right? Or my concrete goal is I want to feed my baby.
Right.
But we have to be flexible in how we get there. So kind of working on like, okay, if you want to breastfeed, maybe breastfeed. Yeah, it is hard. And that's something I think we need to say more out loud so we don't shame people where, again, there's this then idea of like, okay, my body is failing me. Like, why
Right.
is this hard for me? Like, this shouldn't be hard for me.
Yeah.
It can be hard. There's a lot of things about having a baby that are hard that lead to a lot of what we're talking about right now with perinatal mood and anxiety disorders.
Right. And if I'm experiencing anxiety or depression, the last thing I need is to put pressure on myself to produce so much milk an hour
Yeah.
that sometimes using milk from a breast milk bank instead of your own in order to preserve your own mental health or sanity is thumbs up because
Yeah.
the baby needs a healthy parent.
Yeah,
know?
ultimately, all of the providers, right, who are involved in a mom and baby's care, and partners' care too, for that matter, they want to see the most successful outcomes, right? And they're there to support you. And so part of what I do is, we'll talk about like donor milk. We'll talk about, let's loop in lactation. I'm very integrated with my team over at Baby and Me. And we'll talk together, okay, like what's realistic? What are the options? What can we do to support this goal? And also like kind of make peace with the unexpected and really find pride and a sense of accomplishment
Yeah.
what we are doing, which
Sure.
ultimately we're feeding our baby, and that's
Right.
an awesome thing.
Yeah. So it's a little bit of cognitive behavioral therapy,
Yes.
right? We're reframing, right?
Yep.
Instead of I have to be able to breastfeed my baby 24/7 for 6 months, what could I tell myself differently, right? Because what I'm telling
Sure.
myself is what's causing me to be anxious.
Yeah, we get lost in the narrative, right? We get looped into these narratives, social media. That's a separate, topic in and of itself too. And I think this idea of like what it should look like, you're wrong or you're bad, if you will, if you do it this way or you don't do it this way. So a lot of times in my office, I'm like, hey, like, what if we just did like a social media detox, or I give them some resources and, let's actually focus on what you're able and willing to do, because those have to be like in tandem with each other. And I think that can really be applied to anything, and so, because we have to also be willing, because if we're trying to force something sometimes, because that also happens, even if breastfeeding, we'll use that as the example, goes to plan, sometimes there's other factors that can, play a hand and can lead still to, mental health conditions.
I love that word you used, concrete. Like, just we can, if the end goal is in this specific situation is to make sure the baby is fed.
Yep.
We got to get there how we got to get there, and you have to be
Yes.
flexible on that path. And as we talk about pregnancy, certainly there are a lot of unexpecteds.
Yeah.
There are twists and turns that you could be, as to your point, have read as many books as you want to read. There's still some things out there that can get you to have to make a pivot. And whether you can do that on your own, whether you feel like you need the emotional support, the physical support, whatever that might be, it's important that we do absolutely have those conversations to do that. So I think that's a good spot to wrap this one up. Andrea, I have to tell you, you mentioned social media. Amie and I, there's probably not a podcast that goes by where either Amie, myself, or the guest will mention, oh, well, and then there's social media, which is a whole other conversation. Literally, that's always the sentence. It's social media, which is a whole other conversation in and of itself. So
Yeah.
certainly that's a path we could get down another time as well.
Yeah. I would say if you are considering having a baby, are you pregnant, or your partner is, or you are adopted, whatever that is, whatever you're adopting, babies are hard,
Expanding your family.
right? Babies are hard, and you're okay. You got this.
Yeah, I think that's, if I could convey anything to anyone, it would be, be realistic. Something I talk about in my office is, recognize your own humanness. When you become a parent, your humanness does not go away. If there are things that, are hard for you now, they're probably still going to be hard for you after the baby comes, and that's okay. And that, because that can be, going back to expecteds and unexpecteds, it can be really hard, where people forget that, like, okay, I'm still a person who really needs like sleep, for example, and that's okay to find yourself even getting kind of irritated, even annoyed, even mad when the baby wakes up 6 times a night. That's okay. You're a human.
Sure. Sure. It's funny when, as we were going through the postpartum journey with our firstborn, one of the things that I felt like I always kept coming back to, my wife's name is Caitlin. And I was like, I need you to do something that's not mom, that's not wife, that's just Caitlin. And if that is sitting down and watching trash TV and getting, getting 12 hours to yourself, if that's going out and finding a class or doing something, that's what that is. I think that's another big part of this whole process too, is coming back down to the central, you are you, and need your
Correct.
cup you can only fill with a full cup.
Yep.
Yeah, I call it's from one of my manuals, but what I use in my office, I know you want to wrap up, so I'll keep it short. It's called grapes. A few grapes a day, like, keeps the psychiatrist away. It's from one of my postpartum depression manuals. And the whole idea is to practice gentleness, some relaxation, accomplishment, pleasure, exercise, and socialization, to aim for some of those. And as they, to your words, Crockett, as they pertain to you.
Right.
So grapes, a few grapes a day.
Grapes. Love that.
Grapes.
Keep them away from the dogs, but I love grapes. Yeah. Well, Andrea Breter, she is the Clinical Coordinator of Psychotherapy over there at St. Luke's. This was an excellent conversation. Would certainly love to have you. First podcast in the bag. Look at that.
Done.
Yes.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Just delightful. So you're welcome back anytime. I don't care
Thank
what
you.
Amie says. Amie, as always, my friend, another great conversation. I appreciate your time as always. So thank you for all the insight.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Absolutely. It is the Just Start the Conversation podcast. It is brought to you by St. Luke's Penn Foundation. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts or at pennfoundation.org. My name is Kevin Crockett. Thank you so much for joining us for the Just Start the Conversation podcast.